There are a total of 19 new throwing pots in this DLC, most of them being the hefty pots, which are like new, bigger versions of regular pots. They can do like up to twice as much damage depending on which pot that it actually is. They can also just get a larger AoE, get knockback effects, have higher stance damage. But the obvious trade-off being is that it is going to be a much longer animation, and it is going to be very risky to use. Now, my biggest gripe with it is that it just does not get hyper armor. I don't know why. It feel like it should, because there's plenty of times where you just get interrupted out of the animation. It would be nice, because in the time that I can use just one hefty pot, I could just use 2 regular small pots, and it'll just be a lot safer, and probably just do more damage too. Now, you still benefit of just using both, because hefty pots do require different cracked pots, meaning that you don't really have to pick and choose between one or the other. You can just run both. And there are going to be some instances to where like the hefty pots are just going to be better than the smaller pot versions, and vice versa. But yeah, for today, we're going to be ranking all of them from worst to best based on how useful they are in PvE. And I also am going to include how easy it is to craft some of these items, because some of these pots are just not that easy to craft, of which there is not really much of a point of using them. But I can still talk about if they're good or not. And yeah, let's just get into it. Starting off at the bottom, I want to talk about all of the Frenzied Flame pots. Now, in a PvE list, it's going to get lower because Madness is just not really going to work outside of NPCs. And using these things against NPCs isn't going to go over that well either, because it does take a few pots to be able to proc the Madness, and good luck trying to land a few throwing pots on NPCs. They're probably just going to dodge it in most cases. Now, these pots actually do get scalings in every single stat except for Arcane, so actually can result in some of the highest damaging pots if you have like max level. But the thing is, I still wouldn't really care to use it, because if you're at this level, you're just better off using spells, because it is going to do way more damage. Now, yes, it doesn't consume any FP, which can be a positive, but like the major reason I would never want to use them still is because they're like the hardest ones to farm. It requires winter lanternflies, and these things are just very obnoxious to try and constantly farm over and over again. So in a PvE setting, I'd much rather go elsewhere. Number 16, the Hefty Red Lightning Pot. This is a dexterity throwable pot that is very comparable to like the regular lightning pot. The difference being is that this one is just going to do more damage. And also the Hefty version does actually knock enemies backwards, whereas the Red Lightning version does not knock enemies backwards. It still does the same 10 stance damage, but it just does not get that knockback effect. But the major benefit of the Red Lightning pot is that they actually can chain cast between other types of enemies. So if there are a bunch of enemies all grouped up, it actually will just constantly chain a lightning back and forth, and it can result in more damage. Now the thing is, regular Hefty lightning pots will still just do more damage, even if a bunch of enemies are clumped up together, because both pots get the same AoE size, but one is just going to just do more damage. So you're just better off using that one every single time, and it's going to be easier to farm too. So if you're going to use Hefty pots with a dexterity build, I'd much rather use the regular ones. Number 15, Hefty Poison Pot. Now, this is not going to be doing good damage, but it does do a bunch of poison buildup. Now, I'm not going to value it as much because the FETID pots exist, and these things just do more poison buildup, and they proc deadly poison compared to regular poison, which is just going to be better, because deadly poison just ticks for like twice as much damage, but it just lasts less time. Does only last 30 seconds, but that's perfectly fine because you can just reproc it again very easily. There's lots of sources that can actually help you do this. Now, the major benefit of the Hefty Poison Pots is that their materials can be infinitely bought, so it's going to be much easier to craft over the FETID pots, which have to be farmed, but it's still not really worth using or just worth wasting a bunch of just cracked pots just to craft these ones when poison is just not going to be that good of an effect. Number 14, the Hefty Freezing Pot. This is another status effect pot, not meant to do damage, it's just meant to proc the status, of which this one being Frost, which Frost is like one of the best statuses in the game. It does like a flat 10% damage, it does debuff enemies to make them take 20% more damage over the next 20 seconds. Now the thing is, I don't really care to use the Hefty Freezing Pots because the regular Freezing Pot is just better. The regular freezing pot does 380 frost buildup, where the Hefty version does 400, which is like not that much more for like a very long animation. Like if your entire purpose is just to proc a status effect, I'd much rather just use the smaller one. Now this one is going to do it in like a larger AoE, but that's still going to be a very niche use, especially because like the regular freezing pots are just easier to farm as well. Number 13, the Hefty Volcano Pot. Now this one actually can be one of the highest damaging pots because it does a long lingering effect of an AoE, and when enemies stand inside of this AoE, they can take a lot of damage. Now for the Hefty Volcano Pot, I'm still not going to value it that much. When it comes to like regular damaging pots, the Hefty versions could do like twice as much damage, whereas for the Volcano pots, the Hefty version only does about 50% more damage. So when it comes to the straight up just spamming and DPS, the regular Volcano pot is just going to be better. And also the Hefty Volcano pot just does less stance damage compared to all the other Hefty pots, because that whole like AoE ticking effect doesn't do any stance damage. But the biggest reason why I'd still want to use regular volcano pots is because they're much easier to farm. The volcanic stones are just so much easier to grab compared to like the gas stones that the hefty volcano pot needs. So if you did want to go with a strength build, I'd much rather just have other types of strength pots and just have my regular small pots be the volcano pots instead. Number 12, the hefty FETID pots. Now these ones actually do help you proc deadly poison, and it does do it very quickly. Actually procs poison quicker than like the regular poison pots do. And if you have high amounts of arcane, almost every single boss can be instantly procced with deadly poison. Now there is going to be a few downsides. One, it's not going to be the easiest one to try and craft and farm for. Two, it actually does proc deadly poison upon yourself too. If you just use a couple of these, it will just instantly proc deadly poison. And also there are just lots of items in this game, specifically like the deadly poison perfume bottle that you could just use at every single boss fight, and it's going to instantly proc deadly poison on them. And no, you don't even need to meet the minimum requirements for this perfume bottle either. So if you did want to proc deadly poison on yourself or like an enemy, you could just use this instead. Number 11, the hefty furnace pot. Now these are designed to counteract those certain types of furnace golems, but as a damaging option, they're still pretty decent. They actually can get some of the highest damage out of all of the pots. They do scale off faith, which typically with a faith build, you're always better off using your spells, but these things actually don't consume any FP. Now the reason why people are never going to really use this is because they're incredibly hard to farm. The items that it requires are just finite. There are limited amounts per playthrough, and you're going to want to use these things for those furnace golems instead. If they did actually end up a way to make these things not finite, then they'll be a lot more useful, but at the moment, I don't really care to use them ever. Number 10, the hefty oil pot. Now this actually does oil up enemies to make them take more fire damage on the next attack, and this one actually is going to be 65% more damage, which is a better version than all of the other oil sources in this game. And being that it is a hefty pot, it actually can do it in an AoE, so you actually can just oil up a whole bunch of enemies in a big group, and you could just use your fire-based attack to just hit them for way more damage. Now it's still going to be very situational because it's just going to be on the next hit, so it's going to be better paired alongside fire-based attacks that can just do one big attack. So something like the Blasphemous Blade could be really good, or like another pot. But in that instance, in the time that you actually throw out a big giant pot, you could have just used like 2 weapon skill attacks of the Blasphemous Blade. You could have just thrown out 2 pots instead, and you would have just done twice as much damage anyway, which is just better than just doing 65% more damage. Especially because like the time that it takes to actually throw a whole pot, hit them, it is very risky, and it's just going to be a debuff for like just one hit. So there might be certain circumstances of which it's going to be very useful, but for the most part, I wouldn't really bother wasting my time trying to debuff enemies with this thing. Number 9, the Eternal Sleep Pot. Now this is like the regular sleep pot, but it just inflicts eternal sleep instead, which is just going to be better. It means that regular trash mobs that can be put to sleep are just not going to wake up even if you do hit them. And against like the Godskin, it means you can hit them for like an additional 5 seconds before them actually waking up. Now it is going to consume like twice as much FP, and sleep is still going to be very situational. It's only going to be useful against like a handful of bosses and like some enemies here and there. But the major benefit of this sleep pot over the other one is that the crafting material is very easily farmed. So you can actually get an infinite amount of these sleep pots a lot easier than you could with the regular sleep pots. Number 8, we have the hefty fly pot. Now this one is going to be a bleed based pot. You can throw it out, it summons a whole bunch of these blood flies, and actually will do a bunch of blood loss build up over time. Now the major problem of this one is that it is going to require enemies standing inside of the AoE just to benefit of that blood loss build up. So against enemies that are a bit like more mobile, like to move around a whole bunch, this is going to just move out of the AoE, of which you're not going to really benefit as much. And then combined with the fact that you have like a slow throwing pot, it's not going to be like the easiest thing to use, but against those like larger enemies that don't really move as much, it is just going to be like upwards of 500 blood loss build up, which is going to be very good if you do have like those high amounts of arcane builds. But if you do have an arcane build and you're already using a bleed based build, it's not going to be that useful because you're going to take a few steps more forward and just hit enemies with your weapons and just end up proccing bleed a lot faster. But if you do have like a poison based build that's not really utilizing bleed, you could just use this as another option. You can just throw a couple of these, proc bleed like once, and against a boss fight, this is going to be like 15% damage. Number 7, the hefty fire pot. It is just a fire-based pot, does scale of strength. It works the same way as every other hefty pot, does the same 10 stance damage, gets the same knockback effect, does have a nice solid AoE. I think like the major benefit of this is just having a strength-based projectile option. If you weren't using like the claw mark seal and some incantations, you could just use this as like a nice solid fire-based projectile attack if you were to go up against those enemies that are weaker to fire damage. Now against almost every other enemy, I would rather just use the hefty rock pots instead, because those ones are just easier to craft, can do more damage, and can do more stance damage. So that's going to be the better strength-based option. But once again, against enemies weaker to fire, this one is going to be better. Number 6, the hefty magic pot. This is the intelligence-based version of the hefty pot. Is going to do pure magic damage. Still going to work the same way as the other hefty pots in the same 10 stance damage, the same knockback effect. but this one is just going to get an S scaling in intelligence, and it is going to consume about 9 FP. Now, typically when you do spec into an intelligence-based build, you're just better off using spells because they can just do more damage. But in this instance, this one can actually output a lot of damage. You use things like the Companion Jar, the Great Jar Helmet, and this thing can actually just do more damage than most other spells. Obviously, this spell being very comparable to the Cannon of Heimer, I was testing out the damage differences at about 50 intelligence with the Academy Glintstone Staff. This one was getting about like 30% more damage, and it consumes like a lot less FP, and it's still going to have that same knockback effect and do the same stance damage too. So if you did want like a solid AoE based projectile attack for an intelligence based build, you could just craft these pots instead. It's going to save you a lot of FP and save you a spell slot. Number 5, the Red Lightning Pot. Now, as I mentioned with the hefty Red Lightning Pot, it's going to work the same way, and that this one actually does less damage than the regular Lightning Pot, but against enemies that are grouped up together, it is going to chain back and forth. Now, what that means for the Red Lightning Pot is that the AoE is actually larger, and then when there's multiple enemies nearby, it's just going to end up doing more damage as well. Now, typically against single targets, you might just want to use the regular lightning ones instead, but these pots are just way easier to craft because the materials are easy to farm, or you can just infinitely buy them. And being that it scales off dexterity, it's extremely useful. If you don't have a projectile-based option with your dexterity build, if you didn't want to spec into a bow or nothing like that, you could just use these instead. It's going to be a nice AoE, it can do nice damage, it's not going to consume any FP, they're easy to craft, and you can carry up to like 20 of these things. Number 4, the Hefty Lightning Pot. Now, as I mentioned with the other red lightning pots, this one is just going to be amazing because it does the most damage compared to all the other lightning ones, and it is going to scale off that dexterity stat. And being that dexterity doesn't really have like a seal or a staff to help actually get spells, you're probably going to be lacking a projectile-based option, of which these pots are going to be very useful. Because they do scale very well, they're going to be a nice AoE attack, they can actually be thrown very far, and best of all yet, they're doing lightning damage. A lot of enemies are weaker to this damage type. And every single time that it's raining or you're surrounded by water, that's just even more damage. So if you do have a dexterity build and you didn't really care to use a bow, I would just stack up on like hefty lightning pots and like red lightning pots. These things are easy to farm, and you're just only going to benefit. Number 3, the hefty Rancor pots. These are going to be a faith and intelligence based pot. Does actually shoot out a bunch of these like skulls after exploding, which are very comparable to the Ancient Death Rancor spell. Now, these are probably going to be the highest damaging pot in the entire game, because it does scale off both faith and intelligence. So speccing into this particular build or being at a very high level, this is probably going to be the pot to use. But even if you're not at these higher levels, you still benefit off using it because it does have insane amounts of tracking. Very comparable to Ancient Death Rancor, but it can just do more damage too. I was testing it out with the Staff of the Great Beyond at 60 Faith and Intelligence, and it was just doing a bunch more damage, and it only consumes 9 FP. Now, the skulls don't really travel as far as Ancient Death Rancor, but the tracking is as hard, but you can potentially hit enemies at a further distance because you can throw the pot, and in combination with the pot throw and the skull's travel distance, it's just going to result in just a total overall further distance. And these things also do get some of the highest stance damage out of all the pots. If you hit with a pot directly and all the skulls, it's doing about 13 to 14 stance damage. Number 2, the Hefty Rock Pot, which is your lone physical damaging throwing pot in this game. It's just a pot with a bunch of rocks inside. Somehow you needed like a cookbook for that. Don't know why you need instructions to put rocks inside of a pot, but the results are really good. This thing gets an S scaling in strength, of which it can get some of the highest damage compared to all the pots, because a lot of enemies are just more weaker to physical damage compared to elemental damage. It's going to have good synergy with Flame Get Me Strength, and it also does get the highest stance damage out of all the other pots at 15, which for comparison, that is just as much as a Stoner Garank. So if you're lacking a projectile with your strength build, you can just craft a whole bunch of these. The materials that they require are called round rocks. They're very easy to try and grab, and the funny thing is about these round rocks, they also just do some decent damage when you throw them. It's not going to be as much, nor actually go as far, but you actually can hold up to 999 of these things, and you could just throw these instead. Number 1, the Hefty Rot Pot, which Scarlet Rot in this game is incredible, and this is probably going to be the best version of it and the best way to proc it too. Now, compared to the regular Rot Pot, that one doing 300 Rot build-up, this one is going to be doing 400, which yes, you could do it quicker with the smaller one, but there is going to be 2 major benefits of the Hefty Rot Pot. One is that it is going to be doing the 30% damage instead of the 15% damage. If you didn't know, there are 2 different versions of Scarlet Rot. There's like the normal version and like the deadly Scarlet Rot, we'll call it. The normal version is typically on things like weapons and the pots, which do about 15% damage over 90 seconds. Where like the deadly Scarlet Rot is typically on the spell-based versions, and they'll do 30% damage over 90 seconds. But now this Hefty Rot Pot is also going to be in that category. And best of all yet, these things are easy to farm. Unlike the regular pots that require Aeonian butterflies that are finite items, these ones requires Scarlet Bud, which are probably like the easiest crafting material to farm in this DLC. You can get a whole bunch of these very easily. And all it takes is like a couple of like rot pot throws just to proc Scarlet Rot on most bosses in this game. And the fact that it does not scale with anything, has no requirements, and all you gotta do is just throw it like once or twice against a boss, and it's just going to be 30% damage over the next 90 seconds, is kind of insane. You just benefit of using this rot pot with any single type of build. It is just that good. The next video is going to be touching on more consumables, going to rank all like the damaging based tools and stuff like that. The other like throwable based options, I'll rank those, and I'll make another video ranking all the buffs as well. So if you wanted to see those, definitely do subscribe for that. And also do follow me on Twitch as well, because I am live there every single day in the middle of doing a level 1 run. So if you wanted to check that out, give me a follow there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.